once again, we find ourselves in a too familiar position. Secret meetings over the financial future of our country are being held as we head toward the final hours, really final minutes, has been the pattern around here, of an agreement that will be produced for us and expected to be passed by a committee of 12. It's less than a week until the deadline, and no language has been made public. And the American people should be able to make their voice heard before the committee votes, because the truth is, once that vote happens, there'll be no opportunity to change their product. It'll be up or down. The train will have left the station, and the bill will hopefully, or maybe, will be a good bill that can pass, but we won't have any opportunity to amend it. That's not the way Congress was set up to work. I just happened to catch this morning a statement by former Secretary of Defense under President Bush and President Obama, Robert Gates, and this is a statement he made in an interview. "I think, frankly, the creation of this Supercommittee was a complete abdication of responsibility on the part of Congress. It basically says, this is too hard for us. Give us a BRAC. Give us a package where all I have to do is vote it up or vote it down, and I don't have to take any personal responsibility for the tough decisions. So now we're left with this sword of Damocles hanging over the government, hanging over defense, and if these cuts are automatically made, I think the results for our national security will be a catastrophe." That's what the former Secretary of Defense said recently. Admiral Mullen, when asked about this in response to a question I asked him at the Armed Services Committee, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said, quote, "If this sequester takes place, it has a good chance of breaking us and putting us in a position not to keep faith with this all-volunteer force that has fought 2 wars. It will impose a heavy penalty on developing equipment for the future. It will hollow us out," close quote. So one of the reasons I'm here this morning is to issue a warning and call attention to some matters that I believe are important. People will make many promises about what this deal will be about if it passes and they reach an agreement. Hopefully they'll reach an agreement that's one that can be honestly defended and we'll all be happy to vote for. But what we've seen so far indicates that secret deals, while they remain secret, are promoted to be far better than they are when you begin to see what's really in them. The devil will always be in the details. Yesterday on the floor, I spoke about the Budget Control Act's disaster funding gimmick. Over 10 years, the cumulative cost of this gimmick will be about $140 billion to the Treasury, including interest. And just a few words tucked into a bill, and people didn't understand that disaster gimmick. It came out at the 11th hour into the final agreement, and people voted on it without fully understanding what it meant. So just a few words can dramatically alter the future fiscal situation of our country. And the record of broken promises is long, improvident promises about what a bill would do. Many deals have been proposed that have promised serious spending cuts and minimal tax increases, only for the reverse to be actually true. Let me run down a brief list. The President's budget he submitted earlier this year, he said, quote, "It does not add to our debt." Clearly one of the most dramatic, erroneous, blatantly false statements ever issued by a President of the United States. The reality is that that budget would double the debt of the United States in 10 years. That budget would have as its lowest single annual deficit, according to CBO, an annual deficit, a deficit of $740 billion, with deficits in the years 8, 9, and 10 up to $1 trillion again. It increased spending, it increased taxes, and it increased the debt more than if we'd done nothing. The president's budget did. Then the Senate Democrats talked about a budget I called a phantom budget. We haven't had one in the Senate for 932 days, so they talked about a budget. And they made some claims. We never saw it in detail, never saw the details, but they claimed it had $2 trillion in spending cuts and $2 trillion in tax hikes. $1 of tax hikes for every $1 of spending cuts. The president earlier this year acknowledged that you should have $3 of spending cuts for every $1 of tax increases. Of course, that's been abandoned now. But the reality was that phantom budget that was talked about but never produced, but an outline was produced, actually had, we think, $2 in tax hikes for every $1 in spending cut. Then Senator Reid, during the effort to raise the debt limit, his revised proposal claimed a $2.4 trillion in deficit reduction. And the reality was that they were counting $1.1 trillion in savings from war cost, because the CBO assumes the war cost will be the same for 10 years. But it was never going to be the same for 10 years. We're always going to bring the war cost down as soon as we possibly could. There's a phony claim that you've cut $1 million in spending and reduced spending $1 trillion, by claiming credit for war costs that we are on a steadfast path and have been to reduce. The President's Supercommittee proposal that he submitted to this committee of 12 claims $2 in cuts for every $1 in taxes. But the reality is we see it, and there's no real cuts, and 100% of the reduction will come from taxes, more spending, more debt so far. So if this committee proposes a solution and asks us to vote for it, here's some things that we should look for and not be happy with if they're in the bill. The pattern has been, I just would say, for the promoters of these agreements to spin them to sound better than they really are. One of the things we should look out for are claims of spending reductions that occur by setting a cap on war spending, as I indicated. The money was never going to be spent. Some are claiming $1 trillion in savings from that. That should not be counted. Another thing we would look at are front-loaded promises, front-loaded revenue increases, tax increases that occur now, along with back-loaded promises of spending cuts in the future, in the out years. And then they claim these savings. But the pattern around here is that once a tax increase is passed, it's there. But a promise of a spending cut in the future very often does not become a reality. We know that. That's the pattern that's put us in such a desperate financial condition today. Just that kind of activity. So whatever happens this time, this cannot be part of the process. We need to watch for a plan that would rely on directions to standing committees in the House and Senate to, at some point in the future, produce legislations that might reduce entitlement spending and or would raise revenue. These committees have not followed through on that in the past, and the Supercommittee's directions to them, we have to know, are not likely to occur based on history around here. That's the historic reality. Just directing a committee to raise taxes or cut spending does not at all mean that they're going to do it. Another thing we need to watch out for is if the committee makes unrealistic cuts to programs without reforming those programs, like the current assumed annual cuts that are in law today to health care providers, doctors, and hospitals, to cut their reimbursement rates. Congress knows we can't go forward with those cuts, and they've been avoided every year by finding money, borrowing money to pay to avoid very serious cuts to our providers that indeed, if not paid, they'll quit doing Medicare and Medicaid work. Doctors don't have to do that. And it's just at a point you can't cut providers anymore. Another thing we need to watch out for is a plan that assumes unrealistic changes to the Congressional Budget Office baseline. One of the things is to assert a overly optimistic economic growth projections for the next 10 years. More and more we're hearing that coming out of this recession is going to be a long, tough, slow slog. And if you want to spend more money and you claim you've got a budget that improves our financial situation, one way to do it is just assume more growth than is actually going to occur, that the experts don't believe will actually occur. If you do that, that's phony accounting. It may look your numbers may look better today, but not as the years go by. And that's the kind of thinking that's got us in the deep debt hole we're in today. Another thing to watch out for is the claim that interest savings derived from tax increases by reducing the deficit are a spending cut. Interest expense, and it's substantial for our country, interest expense is a byproduct of spending and taxes. If you drive up debt, your interest payment will go up. If you raise taxes and reduce the deficit, then interest rates drop. You can't count the interest reduction as a spending cut. That's not cutting any real spending. That's just avoiding a future interest growth that would have occurred if you haven't done it. So I don't think we should count, and we must not count, interest reductions, either from tax increases or spending cuts, really, as a spending cut. I'd also like to talk about the defense cuts briefly. Majority Leader Reid said this just yesterday, I believe it was, quote, "If this committee, the Supercommittee, fails to act, sequestration, that is automatic cuts, are going to go forward," he says, quote, "Democrats are not going to take an unfair, unrealistic load directed toward domestic discretionary spending and take it away from the military." In other words, take the cuts away from the military, the automatic cuts that would fall on the military, which are, as Admiral Mullen, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, will hollow us out. These automatic cuts are odd. They protect from any cuts the surging food stamp program. Any cuts are prohibited against the Medicaid program. But the Defense Department, which has already taken $489 billion in cuts, is facing another $600 billion in cuts. It would be a 20% net reduction in defense over the next 10 years. I mean from current spending levels, not projected increases. It would be the most severe hammering of the Defense Department while protecting other programs from any cuts. It is not legitimate. Yet the Majority Leader is pushing back and saying this is perfectly legitimate. And he's not going to have cuts in discretionary spending. He wants them to fall on the military. Majority Leader's comments suggest that defense increases have increased faster than domestic discretionary spending. But nothing could be further from the truth. From fiscal year 2008 through 2011, defense budget increased base budget by just 10% and only 84% over 10 years, while education spending surged 67% in the last 2008 through 2011.
Minority time has expired.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to have one additional moment.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we're at a historic point. I believe that this Congress has taken a great risk in turning over to a committee of 12 this responsibility. It's going to be difficult for them to reach an agreement. If they don't, damaging sequestration could occur. If they do reach an agreement, we've got to be sure it's an honest agreement that actually achieves what they promise, which is at a minimum of $1.1 trillion in deficit reduction. We really need $4 trillion, as every expert has said, over 10 years in savings to begin to put this country on the right path. We're nowhere close to that. And I really feel like that the country is going to have to take some tough medicine. Hope the committee can help us get there. I do not approve of the process, but hopefully it'll work, and maybe we won't repeat it in the future. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.